I'm Max Young, and this meeting is being recorded. I am Max Young, and I'm part of SOAR, which stands for Save Our Amazing Richmond. And it's a group of neighbors in District 1 who care about our community and our city, and are doing our best to work together to share information and find solutions to what we see as the central issues that we're facing in San Francisco. We are thrilled to have you here to listen to this panel discussion on restorative justice. This is our second event in a three-part series of issues concerning criminal justice in San Francisco. The first event was what is the job of the DA, and the panelists included ADAs from several counties throughout California who discussed responsibilities and issues surrounding running a DA's office. Tonight, we'll cover the topic of restorative justice and ask some important questions. What's the definition of restorative justice? How does it work in practice? And how does it work in San Francisco specifically? When is it most effective? When isn't it effective? And hopefully we'll be able to get a chance to get into it. A few housekeeping items. This event will be recorded, as we said earlier, so please keep that in mind. We'd like to limit the chat to questions only. Side conversations, debates are distracting. So we're asking you, please only use the chat for questions for the panelists. We'll do our best to get everybody in as it comes. But we really want to kind of keep this as an informational thing. And we've got some really great speakers here tonight. So we're very excited to get going. We are lucky to have a good crew. So I'm going to jump right in and let our speakers introduce themselves. And I'm hoping we can start actually with Lara Bazelon. And if I have your name wrong, please let me know.
No, thank you. It's actually Lara Bazelon, but it's a very hard name to say. So thank you for having me. And it's really an honor to be here with so many distinguished panelists. I am happy to talk about what I know about restorative justice, which is mainly in terms of a lot of research that I did when I was writing a book that I published in 2018 about this topic. And I was really fortunate in doing that research to be able to observe a 2.5-day retreat that brought together people who had been harmed and people who in some ways felt very culpable for that harm together to kind of sort through the root causes of what happened and talk about a path to healing moving forward. So I ended up really getting very interested and invested in the research about that and started thinking about it as an alternative in certain instances to the traditional system that we have to deal with crime. It's not appropriate in every case. And I think what's really important to emphasize, and we have someone from the DA's office who will walk us through all the steps, is that it's victim focused and victim centered. So really there isn't any restorative justice without buy-in and desire on the part of the victim for a different kind of solution that instead of kind of traditional bring down the hammer and send somebody away, involves really confronting the person that you harmed and digging down into the reasons why, and also coming up with action items to make sure that the harm does not repeat itself moving forward. And so I'm excited to have other people chime in and talk about sort of their own direct experiences. Mine is mainly as an observer and a researcher, which is part of my job as a law professor. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Cedric, how about you'd like to introduce yourself? Tell us a little about.
All right, my name is Cedric Akbar, and I currently working for Westside Community Services, which does mental health and positive directions equals change, an African-American organization that's been around for about 25 years, dealing with substance abuse in our communities. I've also worked with when Kamala Harris had introduced the restorative justice courts in San Francisco. I work closely with them with a program called San Francisco Pretrial Diversion. So I had to work closely with that. We have also entrenched restorative justice throughout all of our programs. And the way I see restorative justice is more of a block by block, more of a smaller community, how a community may be able to treat and be able to heal those that have been harmed, those that are harming, and those that, how it affects the community and how we can be able to do that in a supportive effort. And what it shows for me is that different communities have different ways on how they deal with situations. Because I just look like when you ride around San Francisco, I was up on in like about 24th Street on the upper part of 24th, just below the Twin Peaks. And they had all the streets blocked off and had people walking with their babies in the strollers and no cars at all. So in that community, restorative justice will look totally different than over here on 3rd and Newcomb, because they don't do that. So this is why I'm saying why I really look at it as more of local. And I know restorative justice started off with, like, in a lot of indigenous cultures, and what it was looked at more as a community where the community takes care of itself instead of outside people coming in and taking care of it. And one of the things I wanted to talk about today is, in order to restore someone, how are you restoring them? Are you restoring them into this culture's way, which they have never been stored in the first place, or are you restoring them into the way that they know? So those are the kind of things that I would like to discuss and talk about today.
Great. Thank you, Cedric. That's awesome. Yoana, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Max, and thank you, everybody, for being here with us tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank all of you who are, tending to your own neighborhood in a very local way, like Cedric said, right, in your own lives and through this organization. For us at the District Attorney's Office, nothing is more important than the safety of our communities. And the reason why we have restorative justice initiatives is because they have been shown to help reduce recidivism, to help address the root causes of crime and harm, and therefore improve public safety for all. And for me, I'm an assistant district attorney in the Restorative Justice Unit. I'm relatively new to the office. I've been here since September. And before that, I was both an attorney and a restorative justice circle keeper. So I've participated in many restorative justice processes out in the community, in reentry, also in juvenile hall, juvenile camp, and in prison and in jail. And my own personal story and journey to restorative justice really started as a survivor of harm when I was a child, and always wondering how do we actually stop cycles of trauma and violence? Trauma causing violence, violence causing more trauma, causing more violence. It's just the cycle, right? So how do we end that cycle? How do we end that suffering? And it wasn't, I was introduced to RJ first actually in Rwanda in an indigenous process, right? Like Cedric was talking about, that it was not called restorative justice. Restorative justice is just a Western name for, umbrella term for many community-led or indigenous processes from around the world that are about coming together to prevent violence and to address it in a way that actually heals.
Great. Thank you very much. And then Jim Dudley, please introduce yourself and tell us about why you're here.
Thanks, Max. It's my pleasure to be here with the rest of your guests and talk about this really important issue. Restorative justice. My background, 32 years with San Francisco Police. Police officer, inspector, sergeant, lieutenant, captain, commander, and I retired as deputy chief of patrol and investigations. I'm currently on faculty teaching criminal justice at a college I'm not going to name because I'm not representing them today. I'm also a consultant for police practices, and I write and I podcast for policeone.com. And my background and my relationship with restorative justice actually goes back several years before we started calling it restorative justice. I was fortunate to be on a team representing the police department with Mimi Silbert and Delancey Street. We had people from the mayor's office, from the DA's office, public defenders, sheriff's office, public health, you name it. And we went to New York to look at Red Hook and Times Square and the Community Justice Center there and how it could work in San Francisco. And we brought it to San Francisco and we concentrated our efforts in the Tenderloin area, where we did basically what the restorative justice model does, that we front-loaded victim services, that we looked primarily after victims of crime. And then we looked at all the root causes, the possibility of mental illness or alcoholism or drug abuse or housing or whatever else people needed, to direct people into those services. And I think it was working really well. I remember when we came up with the criteria for who would be referred to the Community Assessment and Referral Center, as it was named, CARC. And we were careful to exclude violent offenders, violent, chronic, repeat offenders. And I think we're in an area now where, with restorative justice, we're seeing chronic violent offenders getting more chances, putting back on the street and being exposed to more potential victims. And we've seen, anecdotal evidence of that, where people have been arrested multiple times, released multiple times, only to go out and commit crime. And I think that's why it's a big issue today. I totally believe in restorative justice, harm reduction, epidemiology, back tracing harm, and trying to put a fix to it. But I do believe that there is room for incapacitation for some chronic career criminals. And I think that's my role today, to address those issues. And I think data is really important. I think when we do programs, we collect data and we look at quantitative data. And I think sometimes when we talk about things like restorative justice, that we talk more about qualitative data, maybe anecdotal data. And I think we really need some hard line data to show results and track people from intake all the way to the end. What happened in between? Were they successful? Do they need another run at whatever treatment they needed?
So thanks, Jim. I'm psyched. This is going to be great. You guys all have such great perspectives on this, and I think we're going to learn a lot. And so I'm hoping we can kind of get this debate, or not even debate, but this discussion started, and start off just by defining exactly what we mean by restorative justice. And to start, I Googled it, and it came up as restorative justice is a noun. It says a symptom of criminal justice which focuses on the rehabilitation of offenders through reconciliation with victims and the community at large. I went a little deeper, and it says it goes by many labels, including restorative practices and restorative discipline. The concept has its roots in some indigenous communities, which I think you guys talked about briefly, where wrongdoers aren't punished, but rather taught to how they've been broken their community's circle of trust, shown to ask forgiveness, and invited to return to the community. When I discussed this with some people I knew through the probation department, we talked a little bit about what worked and what didn't. And what they said, this really started with youthful offenders. And that was the first push, and especially in the school systems where they had that going. I guess, Lara, I'm going to jump to you first. What would that definition be, the same definition that you would use, or are you looking at more as an overarching philosophy or as an actual action plan?
I mean, to me, I look at it as a way of reframing harm and accountability. That's how I think about it broadly. And I think Yoana is going to get to this. I think about it sort of more concretely as asking different questions than the criminal legal system generally asks, would generally ask, what harm was committed, who did it, and how severely should we punish them? And restorative justice really tries to reframe it around what harm was committed, whose needs need to be met, and how can we meet them? And I think, to me, that is sort of the essence of how it operates, but it also operates in very specific ways depending on the circumstances of the offense and who all is involved. Like, you can have a circle process, which I think the ADA referred to as being a participant of, and a circle keeper that involves many people, including the whole community. You can have what are called victim offender dialogues. And so, there's kind of the broad definition, and then there's sort of what it looks like in practice, and that can look like a great many things.
Okay. Well, then I guess let's go right to Yoana. Yoana, you had you're in charge of this. So
A good time. Can I share a few slides just because I've already prepared them? I think it may be helpful for some of our virtual.
I think that let me see. I think they're going to try to make you active now.
I can do it.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, it's all set up.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you for that question. So there are many definitions of restorative justice. The one that I like to use, let's see, this needs to be in presentation mode, is the restorative justice is a way of ethical living that's rooted in indigenous traditions that recognize that we're all connected, right? The interconnectedness of all people and all living beings and the planet. And some of the principles of restorative justice that come from this kind of broader way of living philosophy or definition of restorative justice is that we're all a part of a web of relationships. And when one person commits harm against another, they create a tear in that web, and that impacts multiple people, right? So the second principle of restorative justice that we often talk about is that how harm creates needs and obligations. And that kind of like funky little graphic that I try to make on the left side, right? It was like, if the harm is in the middle, if that's the harmful incident, the needs of the harmed person come first, right? As Lara said, it's a survivor-centered, victim-centered process. We often use the term harmed person and the term responsible person rather than victim and offender. And so the needs of the harmed person are centered. Maybe they want to have, maybe they have questions they want to get answered. Maybe they want to have their car repaired. Maybe they want to never see the person who harmed them again. What they want is primary. It doesn't, restorative justice does not have to mean reconciliation. It doesn't have to mean like we all get together and we're going to be good forever after. Then there's also the needs of the harmed person's family, because they're also impacted, as well as the needs of the responsible person. You know, what was going on for them that they committed this harm, that they committed this crime, and the needs of the impacted community members as a whole, as well as the needs of the responsible person's family. And then the primary obligation that we often talk about in restorative justice, right, is the obligation to repair the harm. And that obligation lies in the hands of the responsible person. They have to go through a whole process to show that they're holding themselves accountable and making amends, repairing the harm as much as possible. And it's when we repair the harm, repairing the harm actually requires addressing the needs of everybody impacted. If we don't address the needs of everybody impacted or everybody harmed, then we put ourselves in a situation where more harm can occur. Justice is not fully served. And so this is a definition that Fania Davis uses that I often rely on. That restorative justice is a process that brings together everyone affected by wrongdoing to address their needs and obligations, to repair the harm as much as possible. And this is kind of like a little helpful comparison. Lara already referred to it, but once again, to go over it, you know, in restorative justice, we ask who was harmed, what are the needs and obligations of everybody impacted, and how do we create a process where we can address those needs and obligations and repair the harm. And in retributive justice, in traditional prosecution, we ask what law was broken, who did it, what sentence, you know, do they get as a result? And so if you look at the questions on the left side of the column and you ask yourselves, like, who are these questions focused on? You know, you're going to notice that they're actually focused on the survivor. They center the needs of the survivor. Needs of the harmed persons are what the process is about, versus the questions on the right side are really about the defendant. You know, who did it and what sentence do they deserve is about the defendant. The traditional prosecution process may or may not take into account the needs of the harmed person. And so as we go through this process of addressing the harm and repairing the harm as much as possible, we get to something that, you know, many people call healing, right? Where if crime hurts, then justice, in a very simple way, should heal, should help make things as right as possible. And when we do that, when we create processes where we heal trauma, where we address the underlying causes, which are often lack of resources, you know, people not always able to meet their material needs in the society that we live in. And when we address those underlying causes, we actually can end or at least interrupt the cycles of violence that are taking place in our communities, that are hurting our communities, and can thus improve public safety. And I'm gonna pause here. I have more slides about the district attorney's office, but to me, these are some of the principles of restorative justice, and I'm with Lara in that this is a way of being that then has many different practices, and those practices look differently depending on the needs of the particular community. Like Cedric said, it's a very local process. It's meant to meet the needs of specific people. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, which is the approach that we are often used to when thinking about crime and punishment.
Fair enough. Cedric, what's your take on this? From your experience, you're saying you're keeping it local in your community. How's that? Is that different? Is that coincide with Yoana's take?
Well, the first thing I wanted to say was, it's not necessarily going against anyone, but I just think it's always a danger for restorative justice to be able to be, for us to even to legitimize it or for us to be able to stabilize it, because when the system itself is already against the people that mostly, because even when you look at the criminal justice system, San Francisco, we probably make up 3% of the population, but we 50% African Americans in jail. So if the system itself is already set up where it fails us, and we put in restorative justice in schools, we putting it in our legal systems, it just seems like we still traumatizing the same spaces that we already have that's in place. And the system itself needs to be changed before we can put the restorative justice piece in. That's the way I look at it, to have a restorative justice program, because all we really doing is just being able, having more harmful institutions and then doing the same oppression that we've been doing forever. And I'm not want to make this about slavery or anything like that. Don't get me, but it was just like in South Africa. When Mandela took over, he instituted it where everyone had to come and confess what they did. So if I murdered your son, I would have to stand there and say that, which is a very painful and hard thing to do. But that's, to me, part of a restorative justice process in order to put everything out in the open, in the air. Now, we may not be able to do anything about it, but at least it's being said. And that's always putting it in institutions and institutionalizing restorative justice. All we're doing is basically doing the same thing that we have been doing long before. And then are we asking individuals to be restored, or are we asking them to act right? That's always the question for me, because a lot of times with the whole criminal justice system where it's set up, it just wants people to be right, but are they actually being restored? The same thing when they used to send people to prisons and say they was rehabilitated. But how can you be rehabilitated if you haven't been habilitated in the first place? And so my point of view with this is that, and I love the piece about staying local and allowing each community to decide what works for that particular block, for that particular neighborhood. That part I agree with, and that will look different in every neighborhood. And so therefore, we have to be able to learn how to work with that together, because even in the programs that we have a 80-bed facility residential program, and we also have like the new Billie Holiday Center. But when we work with restorative justice, what I found, I teach a restorative justice class, and I was using a lot of curriculums and different curriculums. And what I found was most of the people, guys that I deal with, they are the ones that are perpetrators, but they haven't been healed. So how can I teach someone how to have restorative justice when they haven't even been healed? So the process has to start sometimes with them first before we could even move on to sitting people down in a room and having them to be able to understand what's going on. that's why, again, we work it from our community perspective within the program. I tell them that this is a small community that we have here. And this community doesn't always reflect the outside community. And what guidelines and rules that we may have here may not be the same once we walk outside that door. And those are the kind of things that we have to be more aware of when we start teaching restorative justice to people, and that knowing our differences, the things that we bring to the table, the issues that we may have, what may work in this neighborhood may not work in the next neighborhood. But that's kind of where I'm at with this right now.
Interesting. And a much different spin. So Jim, when you were first setting up the restorative justice program and you were working on bringing that back to San Francisco, how does that relate to what everybody else has been talking about?
Yeah, I mean, we started with the YMCA. They were our anchor, and we took people in where the intake was there. People would be ID'd and then talk to a counselor. Sometimes it would be somebody from one of the different agencies, but they would essentially be given an assessment to find out what their needs were. And these were the offenders. These were the perpetrators, not the victims. And so their needs were all funneled into immediate treatment and then put in a file before the court. So the judge knew what all these other influences were and considered them as part of a program, an individualized program where these people got the extra services, maybe got counseling, got back on meds, got clean clothes, a place to stay, but that they completed the progress through with the criminal charge held in abeyance until either completion of the program or until they had to go back and appear before the judge. And I think, that's key to any sort of restorative justice program, where if at intake, they're just referred to a CBO, a community-based organization, there's no real assurance that anything is going to be done, that there's got to be a commitment on the part of the offender to go to the program, complete the program, and then finish it. And when we have alternative justice courts like domestic violence court or veterans court or behavioral health court, I've seen cases where felony cases would be held until completion of the program, and then they could be reduced to misdemeanors, or misdemeanors even be taken off their record completely. And so there was a bit of a carrot and a stick that allowed and assured that the individuals would follow these programs through completion, rather than just being referred to a program and then nobody knows what happens after that. So I think that's really important. And then the accurate statistics to really get a handle on what's happening, how effective, what are the best programs. And if, we're in a city with, depending on who you talk to, a $12 to $14 billion budget, and we've got all these CBOs out there, but as far as trying to find out the success of different programs, they're not readily available. And I think that would be really helpful as far as who gets funded, what programs show the best results, what programs take in people and follow them to completion, and then what's the recidivism rate afterwards, who gets rearrested after completion of their programs. And these are numbers that we call dark figures of crime, in that there's numbers of arrests that never get documented in final tabulations when we talk about things like recidivism, where if a case goes to the DA's office and they're not charged, then that wouldn't count as part of recidivism. Only until they're convicted would they be in that category of a recidivist. And so when we looked at the juvenile justice population, we found, when we looked at the studies, that sometimes kids were seen by people at school or people in criminal justice 15, 16 times before anything was actually done with them. And I don't think that's helpful to anyone, to just keep cycling through a program till either there's some real critical incident or violent episode before they get treated.
Yeah. I guess this, man, this is tough, right? So did you want to continue with the slides? And we'll kind of
Can I
get
say
through
something
that?
though? But Mr. Dudley, but like what I saw, I'm just saying that was about some years ago. But what was coming in to San Francisco neighborhood courts, we had like 10 courts in 10 different areas of the city. At first, it was all theft cases, mostly, theft cases, people stealing. Then it started increasing from theft to drunk driving cases, from drunk driving to domestic violence cases were showing up in neighborhood court. And again, like I said, I'm not trying to make this a race thing, but for the most part, those people that were showing up were mostly young white males or young white females that was coming to the court. The peers in the court were mostly retirees. And retirees mean that they had to have a little upward living style in order to be retired, and they have to come back and give back. So even to their own people, they didn't always necessarily relate. And it was sometimes they were doing their best not to, but sometimes it turned to an admonishment because it's like their kids sitting in front of them or their grandchildren sitting in front of them. But the point I'm making with that is when we doing this, what are we actually restoring when those are cases like drunk driving, which are very serious offenses? And I don't know how much can be restored, and especially when it's not treatment necessarily involved in the case. And most of the people were just getting off on the case, they'd be able to go to neighborhood court and it's off. Go do me some community service hours. Go, I may fix your car or fix whatever happened to you. And that's about it. And I think those offenses like sometimes are a lot more serious than what it was. And I think the idea started off as good. And this is the part that always scares me, that we will throw money at it and we will hire the people and say, do it. And then nobody monitors the process and what you're saying, getting the pertinent information about it. Nobody's checking to make sure that it's effective all along the way. And then you're not watching and seeing who's going into court and who's sitting at the top to ensure that who goes to neighborhood court and who doesn't. That's like the
But I think we're talking about two different courts. You're talking about community courts,
right,
where I think DA Gascon sent out ADAs to the 10 or 11 districts to serve with local police and local community people. That's different than the Community Justice Center that's on the 500 block of Polk Street. That's the remnant of what we originally installed. And I think you're right. I think those community courts had no teeth to them whatsoever. You couldn't compel anyone to appear. And, they were as giving the police perspective, I think I can tell you that any officer I sent to serve as a bailiff to these community courts would come back and say, it's a joke. People are not showing up, and there is no, there's no reason for them to come back. There is no sentence. They're not going back before a judge if they don't show. They were just no-shows. And this is why I say you need to have that, you need to hold something over people to get them
accountability.
To completion. Yeah.
Accountability.
But I guess my question there is that a court, is that a restorative justice court?
They were using restorative
Yoana,
they was using restorative justice curriculum, and they was calling it restorative justice. That's why I kept saying restorative justice. That's what they were using. It was called community courts, but they were saying this was restorative justice.
So Yoana, you want to comment?
Yeah, it's neighborhood courts, I think, is what y'all are referring to, right? In the different districts of the city. And it does use some restorative justice principles, but it's not a full comprehensive restorative justice process. And so maybe this is a good time for me to jump into the restorative justice initiatives of the district attorney's office, and I'll share some slides, and I'll try to reference some of the things that have been brought up already so that we can continue to be in conversation, because both of you, Cedric and Jim, right? both of you are bringing up really important points. I'm going to share my screen again. All right, can you all see my slides? Yeah, cool. All right, so these are some of the principles of restorative justice initiatives in the district attorney's office. It's a lot of words, but basically all of our restorative justice work is designed to center the needs of persons harmed and provide an opportunity for healing. It's also designed to hold people accountable for committing harm and recognize their capacity for growth. Designed to increase community safety by addressing the root causes of harm and thus preventing future harm. To ensure equal justice under the law by addressing systemic racial inequities, which are very much part of our criminal legal system, and to reinvest criminal justice cost savings in community-based interventions that promote healing and accountability. So our flagship restorative justice program, which y'all may have heard of, is called Make It Right. It's been in place since 2014, and it's a pre-charge diversion program for minors. So when we say diversion, we mean that we're diverting the case away from traditional prosecution and towards an alternative, right? And in this case, the alternative will be restorative community conferencing, which is a process that's held by our partner organizations, Community Works and Huckleberry Youth. Now, speaking
Can
of—
you define what pre-charge is, Yoana?
Yes, thank you. So pre-charge is when pre-charge diversion happens. So after the person is arrested, the case is brought to us, but before charges are filed. So we determine that this case, for a number of reasons, is suitable for pre-charge diversion, and we send it to this program, right? And the whole program takes place. And if the person does not complete the requirements of the program, the case is returned to us for traditional prosecution. So we can still file charges and do file charges in situations where the participant does not fulfill the program. Post-charge diversion is the opposite of pre-charge. It's after charges are filed, when then we divert the case. And if the person completes the requirements of the program, then we dismiss the charges. And once they don't, then the case is returned to us for traditional prosecution. Going back to Make It Right and the important point that Jim made around data and the need for data, Make It Right is one of the programs that has been very thoroughly studied. There was a randomized control trial that was run by the California Policy Lab that showed that this program, this restorative justice program for minors, has been successful in reducing recidivism, participating youth, and in improving victim satisfaction. And that kind of funky little graph on the right side shows compares the recidivism rate among youth who participate in Make It Right to the control. And in this case, the control group is people who went to traditional prosecution through the juvenile justice system. And so what we see is that assignment to Make It Right reduces rearrests by 44% after 6 months. So within the first 6 months of the person completing the program, they're 44% less likely to reoffend than youth who go through the juvenile justice system. And within the first year, they're 33% less likely, and within the first 4 years, they're 30% less likely than youth who go through the traditional juvenile justice system. So we see that this reduction in recidivism effect lasts over time, right? So we've had about 150 cases. Again, we're talking about minors, we're talking about kids, folks under 18 years old who have gone through this program to date. And last year we were able to expand this program to transitional age youth. So folks who are 18 to 24 years old. What the process looks like is, this is like a graph that shows a little bit of how the diversion process happens. But essentially from when the harm occurs, normally the young person is arrested, they go to probation, the DA gets the case, then there's a hearing, the youth is convicted, either serves time actually in detention, or they have a probation term that they have to fulfill. And often that leads to ongoing cycles of incarceration. The diversion program works instead when the young person is arrested, the case is being brought to us, we divert it away to this community-based organization called Community Works. And they work separately with the person who was harmed and the person who committed the harm. They meet oftentimes for months separately with both individuals. With the person who was harmed, they're supporting them in being able to tell the story of what happened to them, to identify what needs they have and what they need for the harm to be repaired as much as possible. And for the person who is the responsible person, right, they work with them to find out, hey, what happened here? Like, what is actually going on in your life? What do you actually need in order to be well? And to your point, Cedric, like, not just make right, not just like, you know, not reoffend, but actually be well, actually like thrive, actually have the life that you want to live. Like, that is the way that I would hope that, you know, these community-based organizations are approaching this work, because it's so important, right, that wellness is centered in this process. And so once they work independently, right, with both individuals, with both parties, only when the parties are ready do they come together in something called a restorative community conference that involves family members, community members, other support folks. And in that conference, the person who is the harmed person says, like, hey, this is what happened to me. This is how it impacted my life. And the person who committed the harm listens to that, right, and actually takes that in and apologizes and take responsibility, and then commits to repairing the harm. And then together they create an accountability plan, sometimes called like community agreements, right, that then the responsible person fulfills over a period of 6 to 12 months, where they have to actually take concrete actions and concrete steps. And there's a separate organization called Huckleberry Youth that actually oversees that plan and supports the young person in fulfilling that plan. And then to your point, Cedric, around institutionalizing restorative justice, I don't want restorative justice to be institutionalized. I don't want restorative justice to be baked into the criminal legal system. This is the entire reason why it's not me, an ADA, holding this restorative justice process with the person who committed the harm. You know, it's community-based organizations that are completely independent of us, that hold a confidential process that we don't know about. We don't know what happens in that conference, right? District attorneys, the idea is for this to be a safe, confidential space so that people can actually go deep and learn and grow together, and don't have to fear that an ADA knows that they admitted to the harm, they're gonna, you know, use that information against them in some way, in this case or in a future case. And if, as I said, if the responsible person actually fulfills the process, then we get to find out that the process is being completed successfully, and we get to, you know, either not file charges or dismiss the charges if charges have been filed. And just a few more quick.
Can I ask on that? So how often would somebody be able to go through that process?
So Make It Right was initially only for, again, minors, for kids under 18.
No, right, but I mean, but what you just said, saying that the DA has no idea what happened in these, once they're sent off to the CBO, then that really doesn't, it goes back to my point about recidivism not being counted. So if somebody continues to offend, continues to go through this process, you know, it's 3, 4, 5, 7 strikes that we don't know. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, we keep very careful track of every part of this process. So if a young person completes the process, we find out that they've completed the process, and then, you know, we don't file charges. If they drop out, if they just disengage from the process or they don't complete the process, the case gets returned to us, and then we count it as a return, and then we actually file charges, right? So I have the numbers somewhere of the actual, like, how many of the youth completed the process, how many of the youth did not complete the process and were returned to our office, if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I'm asking is that once, you know, through your diagram here, we don't see the percentages, how many get to the DA for filing, how many go to the process, but it seems like what you just said was that the DA says, okay, we don't want to know what happens, or it's a private thing now, but it's a public offense. The final, you know, conclusion should be noted somewhere. It should be in the data. And I didn't understand the reduction in recidivism rate either. Reduced to 30%. Does that mean that 70% recidivate?
No, so, okay, so to your 2 points. So the first point, when I say that the DA's office doesn't know what happens in the conference, is again, to keep the process confidential so that people don't have to fear that their personal information and what they're going through and the admissions that they're making will be used against them by the criminal legal system, right? We want the process to be safe so that people can get really real. The in our traditional prosecution process, the people have an incentive to deny what they did, to not tell the truth, right? Their defense attorneys say, the first thing you're gonna do is you're gonna plead not guilty, even if you did the thing, right? So if we want people to come clear, to come clean, to name what actually happened, to take responsibility for their actions, they have to be able to do that in a process that feels safe. And so when I say we don't know what happens in the actual conference, we do know the outcome. And the community-based partners that we have, that we've been, in partnership with for the last 7-8 years, they are professionals who hold restorative community conferences, and they do tell us at the end, was this a successful conference or was this not a successful conference? And we will file charges whenever the young person is not actually going through and completing the program accurately. And as to the numbers here, so I understand that it is a little confusing, honestly, and I'm not a huge data person myself, but what we're looking at the numbers on the top where we see 44%, 33%, and 30%, those are the reductions compared to the recidivism rate that's present when a young person goes through the juvenile justice system. This doesn't mean that 30% of people don't recidivate and therefore 70% of people recidivate. It just means that is the reduction compared to the control group, the control big group being the number of people who go through the juvenile justice system. So that graph on the bottom is actually more of what you want to look at. And I'm happy to send to anybody the full working paper and the full report that the California Policy Lab put together that has a lot more data that's hard for me to understand even. But it basically, this graph on the bottom says that the probability of rearrest for people who go through the juvenile justice system is at about 70%. And the probability of rearrest of the youth who have gone through Make It Right is under 60%. And so that is the reduction that the numbers above are speaking to.
That makes sense. I guess, and maybe this is coming up, but I guess my question here was, and I think Jim kind of alluded to this, is how many, well, I guess first off, Lara had to jump, so unfortunately she had to move on, but we'll keep this conversation rolling. Is one, how many times can someone go through this process? Once it's completed, can it happen again, a second time, a third time? And then how do we know if the charges were dismissed if that person is reoffending or a multiple time offender? I mean, obviously the police who are dealing with the kid or the neighborhood that's dealing with the abuse or the issues knows, but beyond that, if they're not counted, where do they go? And my other question is, who qualifies for this? What kind of charges are we talking about, and what kind of offenses are we talking about? Because as Cedric said, different neighborhoods are going to have different reactions to stuff, right? And so how do we make sure that this is realistic and the right people are going through this process?
Mm-hmm.
So it is successful, right? Because obviously the goal here is success.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Is this a question to me, Max?
Yeah, I think so. It's, I guess, because the DA's office is obviously moving these around, right? So the DA's office gets to make this choice along, obviously with the public defender, and I'm assuming the police might have some input on this as well. But how do you decide what offenses are qualified for restorative justice? And are we really limiting this just to minors, or, and as you said, I saw you expanding it to 24 and up, but how do you choose which cases go?
Right, great questions. And I'm actually gonna go to my next slide just to finish and then I'll get to your questions, and
Great.
you remind me if I miss one of your questions. How does this work? Okay, so we expanded pre-charge diversion to transitional age youth. We're going further and we are expanding access to restorative justice to transitional age youth and adults in pre and post-charge settings where specific eligibility criteria are met. And this goes to your question around what cases, right? So we're looking at cases that are felonies or serious misdemeanors. Again, transitional age youth and adults, not just minors. And specifically, we're again going back to the principles of restorative justice, starting with the needs of the harmed persons. I call the harmed persons myself and check with them. Do you want this person to go to traditional prosecution, or do you want them to go through this program? And here is what this program looks like. They may say, I want them to go to jail. I want them to get the harshest punishment. And that's what we do. We don't offer the restorative justice program to this person because the needs of the survivor, the needs of the harmed person come first. Or they may say, yes, I actually do want them to go to restorative justice, but I don't want to have anything to do with that process. Like, I don't want to spend any of my time on this. And in that situation, there's a surrogate. The community-based organizations have like a pool of surrogates of people who have experienced harm in the past, where then asked to come and basically sit in the place of the harmed person in this specific case, so that the responsible person can go through a process that leads to them taking responsibility and holding themselves accountable. So that is one of the eligibility criteria, is the harmed person amenable to restorative justice. The second eligibility criteria is the responsible person amenable to restorative justice. Are they in a place where they're willing to go through a program that leads to them taking full responsibility for their actions? And there are many people who are not. There are many people who are like, no, I don't want to do that. I want to go to jail, or I didn't do this. I didn't commit this crime. That, like, when somebody says, I didn't do this, they should go through the criminal legal process, because in restorative justice, we're not going to work through evidence and issues of guilt and innocence, right? And then we also look at the criminal history of the person. If there's somebody who have repeated prior acts of violence, we don't refer them to restorative justice. It may not be the appropriate program for them, right? And then we also look at overall, is the case suitable extent of the harm? Is there, and if there is an identifiable person who was harmed, oftentimes restorative justice practices are more successful because they're all about learning and seeing the impact of one's actions on other people. And that is what creates the internal change and internal self-accountability mechanism that leads to a change in behavior. So we get lots of cases. We spend hours on each case, very, very carefully look at all the criteria, all the factors. And we're always thinking about, is sending this case to restorative justice actually going to improve public safety, or is there a public safety risk here that it makes it not suitable for restorative justice, in which case we want.
But you still, what charges though do you accept?
So felonies, right? So
but what kind of felonies? I mean, felonies is
right.
any.
Right, so it's a range of charges, right? Which we can have robberies, assaults, carjackings, even vehicular manslaughter charges when somebody's hits another person while driving. We have not sent any homicide or rape cases to restorative justice, there are other situations, other kinds of cases that we look at very carefully on a case-by-case basis.
And then what is the process from beginning to, like, from arrest to adjudication or to the end of this? About how long is that process?
Right, yeah, I mean, that's what I was showing with the previous graph here. But generally, it takes about from arrest to, for the whole process to be completed is probably about a year.
And then what if the person reoffends during that process?
Exactly. That's a great question. So if somebody is in that process and they commit a harm, then the case gets returned to us for traditional prosecution. If they're in the process and they've already completed the process and have lived and done well for a couple of years, but then they commit another harm, then we're going to look at it on a case-by-case basis. Do we want to give them a chance to go to restorative justice or not? Or did it not actually meet their needs and therefore did not prevent them from committing another crime? We don't generally Make It Right program, which is, as I said, our kind of initial program, did not take any cases where somebody had multiple open cases at once or were on probation at all.
And is this planned for adults? Because we keep talking about juveniles, but is this planned for adults also for the district attorney's office?
Yeah, like I was showing with this slide, we're just this year, right now, this is all very much evolving and we're refining our processes over time. So everybody's feedback is very welcome. Just right now, this year, we launched the Healing Justice Initiative with investment from a private grant. And we're in the process of, we just released an RFP, right? A request for proposals. And we're looking for qualified restorative justice providers who can hold restorative community conferences with adults and with transitional age youth.
Your slideshows are not showing, Yoana.
Well, they're not.
No.
Okay. I'm just looking at them myself, going back and forth.
Right.
Why are they asking me these questions? It's all.
Good call, Jim. Thank you. That should have been my job.
I was like, wait, I don't, it's so hard to tell sometimes when you're on your own computer, but yeah, my apologies.
There we go. Okay.
This is the graph that we were talking about before. Right. And this is the slide about the Healing Justice Initiative that talks about this expansion into transitional age youth and adults.
Okay. So, hey, Cedric, I'm sorry, go ahead, Yoana.
Oh, just a little piece on neighborhood courts. So since you all referenced neighborhood courts, it's been in place since 2010. There are all these different districts in the city. Basically, it used to be only a pre-charge program for misdemeanors, like Cedric and Jim, you were saying it was thefts. Now there are more serious charges that are also sent to neighborhood courts. There are neighborhood volunteer adjudicators who are volunteers, like you said, and who have the time and space to do that kind of thing, who speak with participants about the harm they caused and issue directives designed to repair the harm and address risk factors. And if the participants complete these directives, then charges against them are dismissed or never filed. In 2020, more just data that I just got today, in 2021, 89% of participants successfully completed their directives. 91% was the average for the previous years. And on average, 9 to 10% of participants do not complete the directives, in which case their case gets returned to us for prosecution. And 95% of participants actually appeared at their hearing. So actually neighborhood courts have set a very successful record so far. But again, they mostly deal with misdemeanors and low-level felonies. We're not talking about really violent offenses here.
Are these counted as charged or diverted in the DA's office?
Most of the cases that go before neighborhood courts are pre-charged, so charges have not been filed. But recently, they've also started taking post-charge cases.
But how do you categorize them? Do you categorize them as charged or diverted?
When they're post-charged, they're categorized as charged and diverted. When they're pre-charged, they're categorized as diverted.
So I guess and this might be more of a philosophical thing, and Cedric, I want to get your spin on this. So to me, the premise of when I was reading about the restorative justice, the premise seemed to be, you pay dues to the community in a small town where everybody knows the guy, or in a neighborhood where everyone knows somebody, and say, Jojo messed up Mr. Johnson's, yard, take him by the ear, you go over, you say, sorry, Mr. Johnson, you fix the yard, and you kind of develop that relationship. It's kind of based upon that simplified version, right? And in a small town or in a neighborhood, I can see that working, right? Because you're seeing that person every day. They're looking at you. There's something there. And when we get to the size of a big city, and we're looking at serious crime, or thefts, or someone breaking in and doing, say that Nordstrom thing where, we had a bunch of people rush in and steal from Nordstrom. You can't go and apologize to Nordstrom. I don't know, Cedric, you're dealing with a version of restorative justice as you're getting them back into their lives. What's your spin on this?
Well, to me, when you have people that are, I'm just saying it, for instance, this is their job, going out committing crimes. To me, to restore that means you have to restore that person. And I don't even see that person at the particular time talking about restoring any person that has been harmed or restoring any community that's been harmed. So like the criteria to be able to measure this about whom comes in the court is one thing. And then the other side is that this process, in the meantime, what you've been talking about is, I'm trying to understand, what are the people doing in the meantime while they are waiting this year? Because when I'm doing things, I just happen to, like if I get caught the first time, yeah, maybe I'll stop. But this is something that I have been doing, and it needs to be addressed in a more apt and official way immediately, instead of waiting until we get to the point of mending ourselves. So I'm just saying that it seems like this process, the perpetrator continues to get off and nothing happens really. And the issue also I have, which has nothing to do with this, but is like when we took funding from the police, we had nothing to put in its place at all. And if this is what we're putting in its place, we're kind of behind the 8 ball. And will people really adapt and be a part of that? Because when we look at, and I'm going on something a little different, when we look at our streets in San Francisco right now, when we see all the crimes that are happening right now, is this whole city has to be restored. And this is more of a major issue where we all have to be a part of this. And I don't think it's going to be one community-based organization. I don't think it's going to just be the district attorney's office, but we all have to play our part in bringing this back together again. And it has to be accountability along the line. And nowhere in this do I hear any accountability being held on anyone's part. And right now, it just seems like it's random chaos. People can do what they want to do, when they want to do it, and no accountability for it. And then what we tend to do is say, poor person, or they grew up in poverty and this has happened. But it still has to be accountability on everybody else's part. And that's what I'm not seeing in this particular process. And then I still don't understand, even though you agree with me, how it's going to be implemented in every little small community in San Francisco, because you're still doing the same thing as community justice courts. You're making, like, Bayview is a huge district. I know they are going in and try to redistrict now, but it's a huge, it encompasses about 5 or 6 neighborhoods. So it's no way, and with all the crime that goes on in this particular neighborhood, that you're going to say that that's the only numbers that we have. So that's just like, that's why I'm saying it's just kind of confusing to me. And the whole thing is that I don't see accountability in this at all.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Please.
To me? Oh.
Yeah, to you, Cedric, if that's okay. just when you say, I don't see accountability in any of this at all, like you mean in restorative justice practices, as I've just shared, are some of the initiatives of the DA's office?
But see, I don't even want to make this about that, but I don't see what the DA office is even this straight prosecutions. I don't see those happening. I see people walking in stores, taking clothes out, walking out. Nobody can't touch them. They can't do anything. They go to jail. 2 days later, they back out. Some of them come to my programs and tell me, you go to hell because you can't tell me what to do, because I'm gonna go talk to my attorney. And the next thing I know, they're out of the situation again and they still doing the same thing. So what I'm saying, if there's no accountability in the regular system, how you gonna have accountability in the restorative justice system? Then who from my community is standing at the table with you doing this? Or who from whatever community that's been, I'm just gonna use the word now, that's been harmed or victimized in the situation, where are they present in this situation?
Yeah, I think it's a really important, yeah, I see you, Jim, just one quick second. So on that last point, where are folks from the community in this? This is exactly why we need to hold community listening sessions, community listening circles. It's exactly why the district attorney's office, my own unit, before I joined, started something called the Restorative Justice Collaborative, where we bring together community-based organizations and other like leaders, San Francisco Rising and Coleman Advocates and many organizations in San Francisco, to have these conversations so that the community can give input into how we actually do things, right? And so there's a vision that the collaborative has for a restorative justice ecosystem in San Francisco, where there are multiple restorative justice centers and organizations like yours and others can be better connected to provide the services and the support that our community members need, right? Like right now we have lots of CBOs, but people are still living under the bridge and crime is still happening, right? So to me, it's all about coming together as much as possible to have these real conversations like we're having right now, and to center relationships and to together figure out what is needed to improve safety in all of our.
So let me take you on. I know you had your hand up, Jim, but another thing, when you start talking about CBOs, a lot of these CBOs have adopted the city's policy of harm reduction, which means allowing people to do whatever the hell they want to do. So those CBOs are not holding nobody accountable. All they doing is processing a person and walking them through a system and saying, can you do this, please? And if the person tells them, I'm not doing it, nothing happens. This is the point I'm talking about. Even the CBOs are not holding people, because the city of San Francisco with the Department of Public Health, if you get their money, you have to adopt the harm reduction policy, which means today, do what you want to do.
I see. All right, go ahead, Jim. I don't want to speak more.
You've been taken over, Max.
Yeah.
First of all, Cedric, 100%. I agree with 99% of what you said, probably 100. But I have so many comments. I'm totally blown away that, the DA version of restorative justice is taking in violent crimes like robbery and vehicular manslaughter. And we've seen people killed by people who were arrested for serious charges, let out, and then, they've run people over on sidewalks or in crosswalks and killed them. And that's why I think sometimes when we talk about restorative justice, like we're talking about now, we're talking about it like there's a program that we all know and see and we can all understand, but it's fuzzy. And I'm following the chat where somebody says we really need qualitative, not quantitative statistics. I disagree. I think when we hide behind it's everything's sort of malleable and everything's fuzzy, and we can hide confidentiality by places we divert to, that we lose accountability. There are no consequences for behavior. We are, doing the social experiment with victims in the balance. And I think when we talked about CARC and we talked about who would be eligible for these programs, we were very clear not to allow violent crime offenders into these programs, because if they were out, then whatever harm they did was on us. And one last thing I want to say is, during my time as the captain of the Juvenile division, where we looked into sex offenses against children of neglect and abuse, I had to go to the monthly child death review committee, and officers, parole officers, San Francisco general, pediatricians, social workers. And it crushed me whenever we came across a case where a child was sent back into a home repeatedly. And we had this chronological list of times this child was removed only to be put back with the offender living there. And sometimes children died. And I think when we talk about restorative justice, where we can sort of massage the figures and the eligibility and all these other things, then I think that potential, the harm for potential by these people not seeing justice exists. And again, tying back into victims as the primary person that we're trying to protect with restorative justice, I don't see their role here.
Yeah, I think, Jim, it's a good point. And I think like the big picture of what this is about, and the beauty of restorative justice is it's community-based, right? And so if it's tight and close to the community, I think it's a lovely thing. And I think especially if you're getting kids, I have a family member that works in the probation department, and he spent years on this. And he said, if we get them young and they're in school and they've got a family, we can make this work. And because there's accountability, and there's change, and they've got a place to go, and they've got a shining light kind of to hold them up to that next level. I guess the question is, when we start, when we're in the big city, is it gets so large, and to Cedric's point, it's like you have people who are trying to manipulate the system or take advantage of what's out there. And I don't think that the premise of restorative justice is a bad one. I think maybe it's the execution or the implementation. And in the end, it's always going to be accountability, right? Because in the end, no one can get better unless they're accountable to themselves and to the people they've harmed.
I agree with that. Can I add a quick thing next?
Please.
Just to what I just heard say, about just how much crime there is in San Francisco. There is a lot of crime. There is a lot of harm. Our city is in pain. Our communities are hurting. The Restorative Justice Unit is brand new. The Make It Right program that I mentioned that was working only with young folks, right, until up to 18 years old. Only about 150 cases have gone through it since 2014. And since we expanded to transitional age youth, over the last year, it's only like a handful of cases that have gone through restorative justice. So restorative justice is not the reason why we have so much crime and harm in San Francisco. It's not because people haven't been held accountable in restorative justice and they have gone out and committed harm. We're talking about a very small number of cases that have gone through this. We're still in the initial stages of setting everything up. And we're more committed than anybody in making sure that the restorative justice processes that are in place, that the partner organizations are running, are thorough, that are victim-centered, that actually lead to accountability. That is what restorative justice is about. And we're 100%, crossing our, what is the expression? Dotting our I's and crossing our T's to make sure that we create programs that lead to reductions in recidivism and improve public safety. There have been many other programs that have worked, or some that have not worked. And there's traditional prosecution. And, I'm not gonna speak to the broader policies of our office. I don't have that data. I don't have that expertise. I'm gonna refer you all to the data, an article that came out about some data that our office released in the last few months. But overall, the district attorney's office, our office is filing charges, is prosecuting cases. We filed over 4,500 new criminal cases just in the last year. And that is consistent with the filing rate for the last many years. there was a drop in the filing rate for certain types of cases during the pandemic, and then it went back up in 2021. And I'm happy to share with you once again this this new data report. I found it very, very helpful myself. And I'm also going to share with you, and I'm just going to drop these links in the chat. I'm also going to share the annual report that our office released, where you can find more of the numbers that you're looking for. And also, Max, last thing, there have been questions in the chat. I haven't been able to follow them because this conversation is so lively. I want to make sure that we get to people's questions. So if there's anything you want to select from there, feel free.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to keep up with everything too. This has been it's been great. And look, and this is, you know, obviously something that's going to be a process, right? And we got to figure out what's going to work. Let me take a quick look at these. You know, Jim, I was going to ask you, you know, come from the police perspective, I'm sure that you see, and when you're on the beats or when your cops were out there, you saw kids that you could get out of the system. You just saw kids that you thought you could help. I mean, is that where you'd take this? You know, is that, do the police have input on, you know, pushing toward restorative justice solutions?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the juvenile side of the house, I mean, that's changed so much since I've been there. I think more when we see the public nuisance type offenses, where we see people in severe mental crisis that are just allowed to, you know, be out there on the streets. You know, I think when I counted the last time I was captain at Central Station, we had an average of 20 to 23 people that we took to San Francisco General for 5150, danger to themselves, others, or gravely disabled. And that was with probably another 20 that were diverted somewhere else, taken to a shelter or somewhere else. So for juveniles, it's a whole different ballgame. You do have Huckleberry House. You do have other alternatives. I don't know if the Diamond Street Youth Center still exists, but that was one where we could take kids. But, you know, in San Francisco, we had all these runaways down on Haight Street. I was a captain there for years. And a lot of these kids don't want to go with you. And we have that difference between a criminal offense and a status offense. And you don't have a lot of authority to pluck these kids off the street and take them, to compel them somewhere, especially when they're runaways, where you get a hold of their families and they say, yes, they're emancipated, or yes, they're there, we don't care, don't send them back. And there's not much else you could do. But I think there is something we can do for these people with severe mental illness that we see on the street in various degree of duress. I just read an article where, you know, in my 30 years of policing, I got one commitment on a danger or a gravely disabled. And I read in the paper last week, there was somebody eating a dead raccoon on the street, and San Francisco Psych Emergency wouldn't take him in for gravely disabled.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we fail as a city, that we need to be able to compel people like that into treatment. We have Laura's Law on the books. It's been around since 2004, and we haven't used it in San Francisco maybe 3 or 4 times total. And then, you know, other counties in California still use 647F under the influence of drugs or alcohol in public. We don't in San Francisco. They're not misdemeanors. There's the ability to bring that back and compel these people to go into programs, but we don't do it for whatever reason. I think we do it in the name of compassion in San Francisco. But, you know, until people get serious and start using the tools like Laura's Law, that we start paying attention to Marcy's Law, which is the victims crime bill that gives allowances to victims. I don't think we do that enough in San Francisco either.
Cedric, any last comments?
My whole thing simply is this: until, just like, and this is on a national basis, till America kind of like confesses or admits the harm and the wrongs that it continue to do, and what has had transpired here in San Francisco, the harms that we have caused to the people now, where we have people laying on the street, people on fentanyl sitting in the middle of the street, we walking past it and walking by it and acting like it don't exist. And then we keep throwing Band-Aids at it. And I'm not saying that jail is the solution at all, but I mean, again, the big word for me tonight, I will say again, is accountability, because everyone has a right to be able to walk down a sidewalk. People should be able to walk without people urinating in their face or defecating in certain areas in the city. And for me, on the whole part, this is what we have. And then in certain neighborhoods, it don't happen. And I don't understand why that is so. And you know, so it just has to go across the board. And then we push everything into one little community, and I'll have those residents have to be able to put up with that. And like I said, that's just not right. So the accountability piece, like Jim was saying about offering people the treatment. And if you're gonna offer people treatment and help, we don't have enough beds in San Francisco for them. The agency I work for now, like I said, we opened up 3 facilities within 6 months, and they're all full. And it didn't take but a month to fill them up. And we were talking about total abstinence, in which the city is kind of like against, but it filled up that quick. And we have to really stop doing this old housing first, because how can you put a person in a house if they got mental health issues and they got substance abuse issues? I mean, it's a whole lot of things that I know that is not necessarily on this line tonight, but until we address those things, it's kind of hard to be sitting here talking about restorative justice when everything is all in disarray. So, and I mean, I know some people may have it comfortable where they might be and may not, you know, tend a black eye to it and don't see it, but those are the kind of things that needs to be addressed in a big way. And I still will say that it's going to take everybody in San Francisco to be able to do it. And we're going to have to set our differences to the side. We're going to have to set whatever we might believe in aside to be able to make a better San Francisco. And because I get so tired of this system, they go against the police. The police is doing this, that, and the other. Whatever, we need the police. I don't care what nobody say, we still need the police. And what we have to do is learn how to work together with each other. And then you'll have somebody going against the district attorney's office or going against this group. But we spend a lot of time going against each other while the city continues to fall apart. And it needs to stop.
Well, thanks, Cedric. And you've given us topics for the next like 4 forums, which is awesome. So hopefully you'll come back and we can do more of these. We really appreciate your time. You want to take us to close here?
Sure, I'm happy to chime in a little bit. I've really appreciated this conversation. I'm learning a lot from Jim and from you, Cedric, and want to just name for all the questions that were not answered in the chat. I'm going to drop my email address in the chat, so feel free to just literally copy and paste that question and send it to me, and I'll do my best to answer it. I apologize that we didn't get to everything. And just to name that, yeah, it really hurts. It really hurts where things are right now. And this is why, you know, I pray every day that my work for this office will serve the people of San Francisco. And I work as hard as I can to make that happen. And like, I'm just one person, and the Restorative Justice unit has one attorney, that's me. And the DA's office is only a certain number of people. And like Cedric said, it's gonna take all of us working together to be able to address these issues. We're all committed to safety. We all want well, you know, for all of our people. And if the traditional approach of the criminal legal system was working, we wouldn't be here where we are right now. So we have to try alternatives. We have to create them along with the most impacted community members at the table. And then we have to measure how we're doing. Are we creating the kinds of changes we want to create? Are we reducing recidivism? Are we meeting the needs of victims? Are we improving public safety? Like you were saying, Jim, we need data, we need evaluation, we need to see what's effective, what's not effective. In that process is sometimes messy. That process requires refinement over time. And ultimately, right, like restorative justice is about accountability, and to actually create the full growth that an individual needs to go through to not reoffend. It requires also housing and mental health support and education and job opportunities and the kinds of things that are much bigger than the restorative justice program in itself. And so the RJ, facilitators that work with Huckleberry Youth and others, they're trying to connect youth, right? And eventually when we work with adults, there'll be other organizations that will be doing that for adults, connecting them with services, connecting them with the things that they actually need in their lives, so that we can create, right, a really supportive web around that individual and help, stop the kind of behavior that is harmful to them and to everybody else. And so that is where I'm going to leave it. And I really appreciate this conversation again. And I really have faith that if we can be real, if we can be honest, and if we can come together, we can create the kinds of change that our kids certainly deserve.
Well, thank you. And thank all of you for coming. I think the thing that does give me hope is forums like this, where we have people who are showing up and caring and giving their time, and people who are coming in to listen to us talk. So we hope to see more of these go in the future, and really appreciate everyone making it. I can't thank you enough for spending your time with us. We will be coming back in April 20th with our next debate with regards to the recall. Yoana, again, thank you for joining us. Jim, Dudley, Cedric, Akbar. We hopefully will see you all very soon. Be safe out there. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.